Well, welcome. Thank you for making it to the last session of this Wednesday. Is everyone having a good MMS so far? Yeah. Like the keynotes? Who's here because App Controller was in the keynotes? Yeah. Who wasn't going to come until they saw it in the keynote? Okay. All right. So we've got a fairly small group here today, and if you want to ask some questions, just feel free, jump straight up to the mic, ask your question. We've got a pretty demo-heavy session, but our main intent is to make sure that you get what you want out of this session about App Controller. So make sure you get the questions there. We'll make sure we hit it. We're going to be using, internally Microsoft has a term called dog fooding. It's where we eat our product, use our products before we release them to the public. We have our internal version of App Controller, so we're going to be using that instance as part of our demo environment today. So probably the only thing we're limited by of what we can show you is time and how fast we can type and get through stuff. So feel free to ask questions. At the end of this session today, we've got 75 minutes. We're going to take an hour, and within that hour, we're going to show you how you can actually get App Controller up and running in your environment and get started with it. Who's got App Controller running today? A couple of? Okay, so most people haven't. If you're in the hotel room tonight and feeling eager, or just when you get back to the office Monday, it'll take you less than an hour because we're going to explain a bunch of stuff. Take 15, 20 minutes, get App Controller up and running, and you can be able to see for yourself how easy it is. Who's using Azure today? Yeah, a couple of people. What are some of the challenges you have with you using Azure today? Is access control one? No, not access control. Yes, access. No. Yes. Thanks, Corey. So I'm going to show you how App Controller makes access control in Windows Azure a lot easier. Who's got VMM installed? Okay, much better. All right. Who's using let's do the reel of the self-service portals. Who's using the inbox VMM self-service portal? All right. Who's using the VMM self-service portal 2.0? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk. And who's using Service Manager? And anyone using DCS? Yeah. All right. So we're going to talk about where App Controller fits with all of those portals as well. And what else are we going to show? We are going to show. We're going to show you how to make use of the public and private cloud functionality that comes with Windows Azure and Virtual Machine Manager. So a couple of things that I want you to take away from this session is App Controller is easy to install and configure. And with a single console, hopefully by now we're 3 days into MMS, hopefully you've heard Microsoft's interop and cross-plat story. The takeaway here is App Controller is helping you manage both on-premise and public clouds. So we've got a single console for you to view applications, whether they're running in a private or a public cloud. So my name is Richard Rundle. With me is Tabrez Mohammed, and just over the next hour, we're going to walk you through how to get up and running and do a proof of concept with App Controller. So for folks using VMM, who's already gone to VMM 2012? Couple of people? All right. So my first piece of homework for you is go and grab the VMM 2012 bits, upgrade your existing VMM install, and get it up to 2012. App Control. There's two really nice features within VMM 2012. The first one is clouds. Now, who remembers from Brad's keynote, like the 4 important things about clouds? You want to reel them off for me? Elasticity, correct. Self-service. So elasticity, self-service, shared resources, and fourth one, I'm going to use my cheat sheets. Usage-based. Oh, Corey. I wish I had a prize for you, man.
We have free water.
So the clouds feature in VMM helps you move into getting hold of 3 out of those areas. The usage-based tracking, the pooled resources. The pooled resources is really important. You can see some really big improvements in your utilization of hosts by going to a shared resource model. App Controller comes in for the self-service component. So for App Controller, if you're using the inbox self-service portal today, it'll still be there as you upgrade, and then you can go ahead and move across to App Controller as the self-service portal for VMM. App Controller is designed to be the replacement self-service portal for VMM. For those of you that are using the VMM self-service portal 2.0, and I think that is officially the longest Microsoft product name, App Controller takes some of the self-service functionality that's in there, but a lot of that functionality, that requesting process, the cloud and the very request authorization process that's there, that moves across into Service Manager. So if you're using the Self-Service Portal 2.0 and you want to continue with that piece as part of System Center 2012, look for Service Manager to be the key part that does that. And then tie that into Orchestrator to actually do the automation that sits behind what's going on. So clouds is the first part of VMM 2012 that's a really important reason to go ahead and upgrade. The second one is services. So of the folks that have got 2012 already, who's making use of service templates? Okay, that's not too bad. That's probably a little higher than I was expecting. So the other takeaway is service templates in Virtual Machine Manager. You'll be familiar with virtual machine templates, so they're still there, and they're great for doing single VM deployments. Service templates really kicks it up a notch. And Tabriz is actually going to do a demo today. He's going to show you how, by defining a service template for the deployment of App Controller, we can actually deploy App Controller to use a shared SQL instance and also deploy a virtual machine for App Controller to use as well. So we're going to do a 2 VM deployment for deploying App Controller out of a service template. It's done as one deployment object. We can then upgrade it as one. We can view it as one. We know the relationships for it. So you're going to see a lot of value from service templates in Virtual Machine Manager. And we really encourage you to start making use of service templates in Virtual Machine Manager. Even for single instance VMs that you're doing for machine templates today, take a couple of minutes, wrap them in a service template. It's really going to make life a lot easier, particularly for upgrading and managing those templates. So within App Controller, we let you connect to those Virtual Machine Manager clouds and to deploy those services. And that's great. So that's the private cloud taken care of. The second one is Windows Azure. And so apart from access control, one of the other things that we heard from customers as we were talking to them about what their challenges were for IT management, the other one was for having a single place to manage both what was on-prem as part of Virtual Machine Manager and what was in Windows Azure. And certainly as companies are making the transition to Windows Azure, that becomes more and more acute. You've got one set of tools for doing the deployment up into Windows Azure and one set of tools for doing the deployment on-premise. System Center 2012 really helps be a single tool set, a single product for both managing that on-premise and public cloud piece. So you're using the same tools irrespective of where you've got the deployments. Operations Manager for managing, for doing the monitoring in both places. App Controller for doing the deployment to both places. Orchestrator if you want to do some automation between both places. The full System Center product line is really there and structured around being able to be the best-of-breed management product to do the management irrespective of where you choose to run your workloads. And that's a really key message for us. Moving to the cloud, there's some great financial benefits from moving to the cloud, but at the end of the day, it's your choice, the control is yours, and System Center is really helping you with that control aspect. So tied to that, for Windows Azure, currently today, if you're using Windows Azure, you're typically signing in with a live ID, and if you've got multiple people that need to manage that Windows Azure subscription or the service that's running in Windows Azure, you're sharing around the same Windows Live ID. Now, you don't tend to do that with, or at least I hope you don't do that with your Active Directory accounts and have a lot of shared accounts that you're just sharing around, because you lose all of the auditing and accountability for who's done what in the system. With App Controller, we're actually allowing you to use your Active Directory users and groups to control access to your services running in Windows Azure. And so what that means is you're going to see a history of who's made changes to your services in Windows Azure. It means that you don't have to do a shared live ID and when you update the password, send out an email and manage that whole process. We can actually start to aggregate those multiple subscriptions into a single place too and provide access just to the people that need access to those subscriptions. And so lastly, the other point with App Controller is around some of the managing of resources. The self-service portal that's in Virtual Machine Manager today connects to a single instance of Virtual Machine Manager. Who's got more than one instance of Virtual Machine Manager? Yeah, a couple of you. All right, so App Controller is very likely to be able to help you, particularly if those instances of VMM are in the same trust boundary. Because with App Controller, the single instance of App Controller can connect to multiple Virtual Machine Manager servers. So that's kind of nice just on the surface of it, because irrespective of which Virtual Machine Manager server your virtual machines and services are running, App Controller will show you a single view and let you do your remote desktop, your remote console, your start, your stop, all of your normal virtual machine operations, checkpoints, etc. from that single console. But we'll also do some other nice things. We'll let you actually start to copy resources from one Virtual Machine Manager server to another Virtual Machine Manager server. So if you've got a template or a template of VHD on one Virtual Machine Manager server, with App Controller, just a simple copy and paste exercise within the App Controller console, and you can actually copy that across to your second Virtual Machine Manager server. Plus, we then give you some nice ways to, for Windows Azure and VMM, a way to get files from your file systems that are in your, just a network file share. Get files and resources from those file shares into either Windows Azure or up into a Virtual Machine Manager. The really nice thing about that is for those of you that are using Windows Azure, so who has to use something other than the Windows Azure portal to get stuff up into Windows Azure? Pretty much everyone. You're having to use Storage Explorer or something like that to get your package files and configuration files for your Azure services up into App Controller, up into Windows Azure, sorry. With App Controller, because of the use of file shares and that network file sharing, you can see your subscriptions, your hosted services in Windows Azure. You can see your storage accounts and folders in Windows Azure. You can actually just literally copy and paste from your on-premise network file shares and get files copied up into Windows Azure. And that includes the configuration files, package files, certificates if you're doing remote access, remote desktop or SSL subscriptions. It also allows for, if you're doing the VM role, getting VHDs up into Windows Azure as well. So for App Controller, it is part of the System Center suite. That should be pretty clear to everyone by now. It is the self-service part of our cloud management story. we have a huge application focus. You would have seen that in Brad's day one keynote, and if you've seen pretty much from MMS last year through all of the keynotes that have occurred over the last year, Microsoft's been talking about this application focus, and App Controller is one of the ways that we reflect that. We're showing you your applications and your services. It's not just about the resources, about the fabric that's underlying those resources. And then the last piece for App Controller, public and private clouds. I mean, you're hearing a lot at MMS this week about private clouds. App Controller is also a part of our public cloud story and management for public cloud. So with that, I'm going to pass across to Breeze, and he's going to talk you through some of the system requirements for App Controller, and then do a walkthrough of actually installing App Controller. To Breeze.
So obviously these numbers, they look really small, and that's good. I hope that's good for you guys. Windows Server 2008 R2, so I think that's across the board for all System Center products. That's what the requirement is. We do require .NET 4 and IS7 to be installed in the box as well, but we do install those for you if you don't have that. SQL Server 2008, SP2 or higher, that includes R2, obviously. We do require you to set that up. We don't ship SQL with App Controller. That would just be a lot of bloat. And VMM also needs to be installed as a prerequisite. You would see that as you walk through setup. And then on the hardware side, really small hardware requirements, dual core, 2.8 gigahertz, 4 gigs of RAM, 1 gig disk. If you have dedicated hardware, make it a Hyper-V host, and then create a VM and run App Controller inside of it. I can't think of a single instance when we were developing the product that we were actually deploying it on bare metal. We've always deployed it as we were developing App Controller in a VM, and we highly encourage you to deploy it inside of a virtual machine as well. There's just no reason to dedicate the amount of hardware that you can buy today in a single server for just App Controller. So with that, we're going to get into a demo for installing App Controller. And while it is really simple, hopefully the screens may prompt any questions that you can ask, like Richard said, as we go along, or you can write them down and save them and ask them later. So this server here, CO1. So this actually has the VMM already installed in it, and I believe it already has a SQL instance installed. Did you have App Controllers install on your desktop? Okay. The App Controller install media?
System.
Users, Rich Rund. Okay. Do you want to go ahead and drop that in? Actually, so real quick, while Richard is prepping the bits on that one, we're actually going to do this kind of in reverse just to have you guys not wait around while we copy the bits from our corporate location. We're actually going to jump into what I consider the more exciting way to deploy App Controller. Now, Richard alluded to this a few minutes ago. You can use App Controller to deploy App Controller, and the engineering team that has developed App Controller, we actually do this day in and day out. So when we have daily builds of App Controller that we want to test, we actually use App Controller to go ahead and deploy those new builds. So we've created a service, or a bunch of service templates around this, that will go ahead and deploy App Controller in a variety of environments that we have set up inside of Microsoft. And this, just to be clear, this SCDF ACO1 is an App Controller instance that the App Controller team is actively using. And if I looked at in-flight jobs, I would probably see deployments from our dev and test. So this is not just something we created for a demo. This is actual stuff that we use day in and day out. So as you see here, we have a bunch of App Controller templates. And this is the first glimpse for, I guess, those of you who haven't used App Controller or service templates before on what this experience looks like. So I drop into library here, then I go to browse templates for this VMM server, and I select over here an App Controller instance that deploys it into our Redmond domain, our corporate domain here, with a standalone SQL machine tier. So I select that, click deploy. I have access to a couple clouds. Now these are coming from the VMM server. We have stuff for build infrastructure, engineering, production. Again, this is showing you how our engineering process works behind the scenes. And this is what the service deployment looks like inside of App Controller. Now, as you see here, there's this service. It's a top node here. And it also has two machine tiers, one for the SQL server and one for the App Controller server. Now, Richard was talking about earlier how App Controller is trying to make it easier to deploy services both into VMM and App Controller would have a similar UI. Now, obviously, this is a VMM service template, but if you had a hosted service and the template for deploying that, the UI would be very similar, even though the service models underneath those are very different. So in this one, just to move the deployment along, I'll give it some awesome service name, foobar. And this is just going to be the computer name for App Controller, SCDF test 03. I'm going to give it my Redmond username, and I'm going to give another computer name to use for the SQL Server for it. I click OK. I literally only typed 4 values in, click deploy, and in about 20 minutes, it's going to go from nothing to having SQL installed, .NET installed, IS installed, and then App Controller installed on the second machine and connect those all together so that on SCDF test 03, I can go to that inside of a web browser and App Controller would be set up. Now, this is obviously an RTM build. For the custom build, just to show you the power of service templates and how we use them day in and day out, is to kind of prove that this technology works, is if I go back into it, you see that I have extra fields here. Now, this is a build share for App Controller, and this is another one that we have for VMM builds. Now, our dev and test actually go into here, and a daily build like yesterday's build, they'll go ahead and change the path here and specify that build and specify perhaps a different build of VMM that we're working on and use that, and it'll actually take that build instead of the RTM bits and deploy that when it comes time to install App Controller or VMM. So this technology is extremely powerful, extremely robust, and to prove it, we use it day in and day out. This is the sole way that we actually provision our VMs for development, and like I said before, we don't deploy App Controller and anything besides a VM. So rather, we're not going to stand at the jobs view for that for 20 minutes. I can prove it later for you skeptics out there. If you don't believe me that that's actually where it is. Now, you drop this inside of...
you want to go to ACO2.
Oh, ACO2, sorry. They have the same name. Go over to this box. So we're going to go back to, I guess, the more boring, unfortunately, wizard, click, click, click through. But hopefully it's quick enough, and I just want to jog any questions that you guys might have about how this process works. So this is what the exe would look like that you guys download off the internets. Load App Controller here. So go ahead, obviously click install. Hopefully that part is self-explanatory. I'm just going to check move for any updates. So if there's anything that prevents setup from working, we'll release updates so that setup can kind of self-heal and patch itself and proceed along its merry way. Get past the splash screen here. Product key, I actually don't know what the product key is or an example of one. So we'll just do eval. I've totally read that at one time or another. And now we will check for prerequisites. Now again, the only prerequisite you need to install manually outside of obviously SQL is the VMM admin console. But I said earlier we already have VMM admin console installed because it's just not interesting. And we have the IIS prerequisites installed. If you didn't have the IIS roles and role services that we require, you would get a different screen before this one that just said, we're going to install these IIS things, click next, and we'll do it all for you. But that's all the prerequisites we require. Again, it's a really small and simple product in that regard. So I selected an install path. I want to configure this to use network service, default port. I'm going to generate a self-signed certificate. This is just configuring the website binding that the IIS website is going to use here. And then the SQL instance that we're going to use, it's local. It's already detected it for me. Just keep clicking next. Again, I haven't really changed any values here. I'm just clicking next. Oh, SQL not installed on this one? That's okay.
Should be.
What's the other one? MMS?
MMS ACO2.
SO2.
You want MMS.
Oh, no.
It's got an app controller database on there already.
Oh, it's got an app controller database on it.
Go to the VMM server. Go to rich run -VMM-1.
Like that?
Yep.
Instance?
Should be just instance 1.
See if that lets us go through this page. So we don't have a SQL server installed apparently because we're totally depending on the service template to work. So that would be actually the last screen of setup. You click that, and then the installation process would begin. So now you have App Controller installed. Obviously, we have an up and running App Controller instance here. We have one deploying in the background. We'll check on that one in a second. So the next step of what we have to do is Richard is going to take over and show you how you actually connect your App Controller instance to a new Azure subscription. In this view here, we already have some subscriptions added, but he's going to go ahead and add a new one on his machine.
Cool. Thank you. And totally my fault that the SQL database wasn't where Tabriz was expecting it. Now, a couple of things that you do want to do once you've finished your install for... Yeah, sorry, question? Yep. So yeah, why is so the question is, why do we need the virtual machine manager console installed on the app controller server? And what that gets us is PowerShell. So the way to install PowerShell for VMM is by installing the console. And I can see you've still got like, why do we need PowerShell? And because app controller, the way it talks to virtual machine manager is actually through PowerShell. Sorry?
The modules are shipped through the console. The only way that you can get the PowerShell layer for VMM is by installing the console. So they have three components: the server, the web portal, the self-service portal, which this is obviously the replacement for, and the console. So out of those three, obviously the lightest way to get them is installing the console.
So yep, another follow-up question. How many, yeah, so the question is how many app controller consoles? So the reason we have so many is because we have a lot of testers and a lot of developers and a lot of program managers who all want their own private instance to be doing their own little thing. So we have one, what we call dog food server, which is effectively the master that actually manages all of the deployment. And I'll do a quick delve into our development process. So what we do as part of our development process, we have feature teams that are working on specific features. They have their own builds. Each of those builds have their own capabilities. So they stand up their version of app controller to test the feature that they're working on. When that passes testing, they're allowed to check their changes into our formal source build, and that'll form part of the next official build. So the reason we have so many is actually just the way the dev and test works.
No, so during the development process, people will be working on
We're testing app
features.
controller ourselves. So we want, but yeah, in the real world as opposed to our world, which is somewhat different. Yeah, so with app controller, you can install just a single instance, and you could install it into a highly available virtual machine if you wanted to get redundancy or resiliency that way. The other way you can do it is to install it behind a network load balancer, and you can get resiliency the same way you would any other website. Your original root question of how many app controller instances do I need? It's really just the one instance and then any configuration that you do for high availability. Either run it as a highly available VM or put it in behind a network load balancer. And if you do that, then run your SQL as a clustered SQL so that you've got resiliency for the database. So yeah, typically one, and then because it's a web-based console, users can then just go ahead and hit the web-based console and take it from there.
And a follow-up on not necessarily just that question, but on deploying app controller, number, where, those kinds of questions. Now, because the self-service portal for VMM obviously shipped with VMM, and people may have co-installed the self-service portal with the VMM server, now we have new recommendations for app controller. There's two guidances we have that basically lead to the same thing. App controller here is an IS website, where VMM is a server technology which uses Microsoft's clustering services, like the Windows clustering services, in order to give you highly available VMM management servers. Now, there's a lot of stigma in the IT world against putting IIS websites behind clusters or clustering your IIS web servers. So it would be kind of weird, and it just wouldn't work to install App Controller across all your VMM management servers that were part of the same cluster, because there's no way, like the App Controller instance itself is not cluster aware. So there's also a second point here is when you install App Controller on a VMM server, let's say you were just doing a proof of concept, the mechanism that VMM uses to deploy files from the VMM management server to the host, it uses bits. And bits, by default in VMM, is secure, so it's going to use port 443. As you can see, by default, App Controller uses 443, and you can't manually configure the certificate that VMM would use for its bits endpoint. So VMM and App Controller are going to constantly fight back and forth over setting different certificates for the same endpoint, which obviously Windows doesn't allow. No one allows this. So you would need to install VMM, either change the bits port on that, or change the website binding for App Controller to a non-default binding. So basically those 2 points to keep in mind, and these are documented when you go to install App Controller off the TechNet documentation. Things to keep in mind when you install App Controller co-hosted or co-located with the VMM server, because it is kind of different from previous versions of VMM.
Cool. Last chance for questions? No, not really last chance for questions on install. Any other questions on install? AppV and App Controller, application virtualization between an App Controller. So application virtualization, and are you talking specifically client or server application virtualization? Yeah. So application virtualization for server, so server AppV is a feature of Virtual Machine Manager. It's a way that you can use to help create a service within Virtual Machine Manager. You could then deploy that service that you created in Virtual Machine Manager using App Controller.
So Server AppV is a kind of a building block that you would use to create VMM services. So with that, you have SQL DAC packs and web deploy packages for IIS, and then obviously the things inside VMM with regards to your OS profiles, your hardware profiles, your VM templates. All these are building blocks of creating a service template. But then, like Richard said, you would deploy that service template using App Controller. Cool. All right.
All right. So we've gone through. We've got App Controller set up. The step I'm going to do now is to actually connect it into a Windows Azure subscription. And you can see here I'm in the clouds view, and because this is our dog food environment, I've got access to, this is me, I don't have access to everything. I've got access to a private cloud for our engineering, and you can see I've got a quota set on that, so I've used 8 out of my 10 allowed virtual machines. I can deploy 2 more virtual machines before I hit my quota. You can see that virtual machines is the one quota dimension that I'm bound against. I'm not bound on processors, storage, or memory. You can also see these other Windows Azure subscriptions. What I'm going to do now is go through and add another Windows Azure subscription. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to do a couple of things. So the first is I'm going to explain how App Controller talks to Windows Azure. We spoke about App Controller talking to Virtual Machine Manager through PowerShell earlier. App Controller talks to Windows Azure through their public REST API. We go through their management API for doing that. The way that you talk to the Windows Azure management API is using a certificate authenticated channel. So what we need to do is actually go and create a secure channel for us to communicate through. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a key, and I'm going to keep the private key side of it for uploading into App Controller, and I'm going to take the public key component and upload it into Windows Azure. Windows Azure can then use its public key to authenticate that I'm initiating the connection, and I'm allowed to make changes. I keep hold of App Controller, keeps hold of the private key, so that it's that piece stays with you on premise. This is probably one of the more complicated parts of App Controller. So does that piece make sense as a starting point, that we're setting up a secure channel? Yeah? All right. 3 ways you can actually go ahead and create the certificate for making the secure channel. One is within Visual Studio itself. So if any of you are doing deployments from Visual Studio up into Windows Azure, that is actually creating a management certificate, and you can use that same process and feed that same certificate into App Controller if you want. A nice, easy, wizard-driven way to do it is to go into IIS Manager and go through the process of creating a self-signed certificate and then exporting the certificates and giving the public key to Azure and keeping the private key for App Controller. And using a self-signed certificate in this case is actually okay, because all we're doing is we're controlling the key, we're giving it to Windows Azure just for that authentication. We don't have like a website or a code signing or anything else that need for a trusted hierarchy. If you wanted to get a certificate from a trusted CA, by all means go and get it from a trusted CA, but it's definitely not a requirement. There's not that authentication chain that's occurring. This is just a shared secret between App Controller and Windows Azure. And in particular, your instance of App Controller and Windows Azure. So I'm going to do the third way of creating a certificate, and that's using make cert. So if you've got Visual Studio, if you've got Visual Studio installed, you'll have make cert. It's okay, you don't need to copy this down. This is actually in the documentation. If you go and read the App Controller documentation for adding a public cloud, you'll see a pointer to the Windows Azure documentation. This string here is straight from the Windows Azure documentation for creating a certificate.
And to be clear, this is actually the most difficult way we could have demonstrated this. The other 2 ways, through IIS, you click Create Self-Signed Certificate. We're not going to test your intelligence that you can click a link. So that's obviously really easy. And then Visual Studio can also create self-signed certificates really easily with Visual Studio. So hopefully you won't have to resort to this, because there's 2 much easier ways to do it. But there is a third option if you like to open command prompt.
All right, so I've gone and created this. What it's done is it's already gone and put the public key into the management.cer file. And what it's done is, if I refresh here, it's gone and put, you can see now as it's refreshing, it's gone and put the key also into the certificate store of my local computer. Now, that's actually not where I need it to be. I need to get it out of here and get it across to App Controller. So the easy way to do that, and this applies when you create it through Visual Studio and also through IIS as well. You need to come into Certificate Manager, and the one change you need to do, don't just click Next, Next, Next. Make sure you export the private key. That's probably the most important part. PFX file, choose a password, choose a strong password.
It happens to be password.
And then save your password. Save your certificate. So I've gone through, I've now exported that, and in here I've got my PFX file as well. So now that I've got that, I've got my certificate, so I can now go and glue together App Controller and Windows Azure. And I'm going to do that first by logging into the Windows Azure Management Console. And what I want to do is, I can actually go ahead and delete that certificate because that's the one there from earlier. I'm going to need to add in my certificate, so I can just go and do a browse for
clear path, yeah.
The management certificate that we created earlier. We'll go ahead, that's just going to go and upload it into Windows Azure. And now, while I'm here, I'm going to take this GUID and I'm going to do Control-C to copy it, because I can't remember GUIDs. And app controller is going to need the GUID and the private key. So I'm going to connect a Windows Azure subscription. I'm going to call it the MMS demo. I'm going to paste in my subscription ID, and now I'm going to go and get the private key. I'm going to give it the password to unlock the private key. And with that, app controller is now going to actually be able to go ahead and connect to Windows Azure. And you can see it's refreshed. I've now got my MMS demo subscription added into Windows Azure, and I can go ahead and connect. Now, this box by default has connectivity to the internet. If you're behind a proxy, you're going to want to be able to go ahead and specify your proxy connection before going ahead and doing the before you're able to get to the internet. So to do that, I just come into Connections, I click on Properties, and if I need a proxy, I can go ahead and enter my proxy settings. If I need credentials for the proxy, I can go ahead and enter credentials for the proxy as well.
And to be clear here, that's in case, even if you have a proxy configured at the machine level. So let's say you have some group policy settings which sets what the proxy is for any machine that joins some foobar domain. We will respect those if they're available. If for some reason you want to override the proxy that is used for Azure, this Azure connection, or you have multiple proxies and you want to specify a particular one, that's where you can use this functionality. It's not always required. If you have a proxy, it's only required if it's not defined at the machine or you want to override what we inherit from the machine configuration.
Okay. So now I've gone and added that subscription in. I want to give people access to that subscription. So I can go ahead and do that by creating a new user role. So I'm going to call this the MMS demo user role. You can see here I could actually make this a read-only user role, and people who were members of this role would be able to connect using the console. They would be able to see the services, but they wouldn't be able to do start or stop operations or do deployments to the service. The next thing I can do is I can add Active Directory users or groups. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give to Breeze direct access. Thank you.
There we go.
And now, based on this user role, I can give to Breeze access to just the MMS demo subscription. You can see all of the other subscriptions that are in here. He's not going to have access to those. It's just going to be this one subscription that this user role grants him access for. All right, so that's actually reasonably straightforward, but it is probably the most complicated part of App Controller. But what I've done there is made a connection into a Windows Azure subscription and then provided role-based access to that subscription. There was one other... Yep, no, that's good. All right. Any questions on that process? People follow along? Yeah. Yeah, question right at the back. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. And for Yep, absolutely. And that's what I would recommend, is if you're going to provision user roles, use Active Directory groups the same way that you have security groups that you're controlling access, because then you can use, it's the same thing as you're controlling access to any other resource with Active Directory. For onesie-twosie stuff, like a little demo here, individual access works great. Realistically, though, you want to put people in security groups and use Forefront Identity Manager or whatever you're using for Active Directory security group management, and just use those Active Directory groups. Yep. Yeah, so the question is what's the access levels that we provide. So for access to Windows Azure, it's just two permissions levels. One is the read-only level, so you can go in and see. The second is you've got full rights to do whatever you could do within Windows Azure. So examples of that is deploy a service into Windows Azure, start, stop, delete a service in Windows Azure, upload, download files to the storage account. All of those would be, by not checking the read-only box, are activities I could perform against that Windows Azure subscription.
Yeah, so we don't provide granularity down to the per service control within a subscription, but since creating a subscription within Azure is free, if you did want that granularity, you could segregate that across subscriptions if you are looking for that granularity, and then obviously add those subscriptions into App Controller. And if you have a list of 30 or 50 subscriptions that you do want to add into App Controller, we do have PowerShell commandlets to allow you to add and remove Azure subscriptions in App Controller, which obviously you would want to do that one time to do across 30 subscriptions rather than 30 times of what Richard just did.
Yep. Correct. Yeah. So it's. Well, actually, yeah. So a really good example of that, so the question for people that didn't hear is there things that by delegating into App Controller that users then can't do if they had access to the management portal? So a couple of things that you can do if you've got access to the management portal, but you can't do with just access to App Controller, is when I added that subscription, I uploaded a management certificate, and before I did that, I deleted a management certificate. Neither of those you can do directly from within App Controller. You could upload, you can upload certificates that you use for remote desktop, but you can't upload the management certificate piece. You can still create hosted services in App Controller, but probably the management certificate piece is
obviously
the big one.
There's no interaction with SQL Azure for this release of App Controller, so the functionality outside of just day-to-day operations management of your hosted services in Azure, functionality above and beyond that would be available in the Azure Management Portal, and then just operations on the hosted services would be available within App Controller.
All right. Now, Mike, I got a quick question for you guys. Do people know there's 3 ways to get Azure subscriptions? So if you've got an MSDN subscription, unless you've got one of the really basic MSDN subscriptions, you've got actually Windows Azure usage rights. And they're pretty generous. It's about 750 compute hours a month. So in organizations where you've got dev and test and you're licensing your dev and test with MSDN subscriptions, for each one of those MSDN subscriptions, you've already got a Windows Azure subscription. You can actually use App Controller and feed those subscriptions into App Controller and then use that as part of your dev and test process. So that's already there. The one people are most familiar with would probably be you turn up to the Azure site, you pull out your credit card and do a pay-as-you-go. You can take those subscriptions and put them into Azure as well, into App Controller as well. The third one, for those of you with enterprise agreements, you can actually negotiate Windows Azure as part of your enterprise agreement and get a discount rate on Windows Azure as part of your enterprise agreement as well. And any subscriptions that you get to Windows Azure through your EA, again, you can put here into App Controller and manage them from within App Controller. Yeah? Yes. So I think there's a couple of questions in there. So the basic gist of the question is around with the Virtual Machine Manager self-service portal and what do you see within App Controller and clouds there. And is it just what's created there? So let me go back a step and talk about the permissions model we use when we talk to Virtual Machine Manager.
Should we do that after I demonstrate how to connect to VMM? Because I think I may answer 2 or 3 of those as I connect to VMM.
Okay, run through that and point to me if we haven't hit your question.
Yeah, and whatever I missed, feel free totally to re-ask it. So Azure. This guy's not, his name is not Azure. Richard obviously just connected to some Windows Azure subscription. Now we'll go ahead and do the private cloud side of what App Controller is capable of and connect it to some VMM clouds. So what we require in order to connect to VMM is that the VMM server that you're connecting to is 2012, because obviously VMM 2008 R2 and below or previous, they don't understand, there's no concept of clouds. Clouds is a new concept in VMM 2012. But with that, there's a requirement that the trust level between the app controller server and the VMM server is a two-way, like a bidirectional trust in AD. Now, we have heard feedback that, maybe I have an VMM server that's in one trust and another VMM server that's another trust, and I want a single app controller server to talk to those two disparate VMM servers. We don't support that in the current version of App Controller, but we have heard the feedback, and we're looking into ways to hopefully support that in later releases. And the last bit, and this is with the RBAC question that he had, is we delegate RBAC in role-based access control in App Controller to VMM. So what that means is if you've gone ahead and done the legwork of creating some administrators, some delegated administrators, some self-service users in VMM, when a user of one of those user roles logs into App Controller, we will check what access they have to those connected VMM servers based on their membership in those roles as defined in the VMM servers. So as you saw in the example where we connected to Azure, we provide RBAC. The RBAC model is defined within App Controller. But for VMM, we don't duplicate RBAC. We don't attempt to do our own RBAC on top of VMM's RBAC. So if you are a member of some roles as defined by VMM server, that's what you'll have access to when you log into App Controller. And I guess kind of a little piece of that is when you are doing a login. In this case, you see us. I don't know if we've logged into App Controller from the login screen yet, but if you want to have single sign-on, that is possible. You just need to enable delegation, or preferably constrained delegation, in Active Directory so that you can leverage Windows authentication for your IIS website instead of using plain old basic authentication. So real quick, did that go over? And then we'll have a demo of what it looks like to connect to a VMM server. But did that touch on the questions, or? So again, it would be day-to-day for self-service, but we don't provide fabric management tasks in App Controller. Fabric management, you would still open the VMM admin console or VMM console and do your fabric management, creating clusters and managing your storage, your VLANs and Mac pools. That would all be done through the VMM admin console. Now, if you want to just deploy services and manage your VMs, you would do that as a self-service user through App Controller.
And so the one activity that you can do as a self-service user in Virtual Machine Manager that you can't do in App Controller, so the one thing that you would still need as a self-service user to go into Virtual Machine Manager for, is if you want to author a service template or a virtual machine template. That functionality sits within the Virtual Machine Manager console. What we expect, though, is in most organizations, the number of people who are actually doing service template authoring is a smaller set of your entire self-service user base. So it's just that group of people who would need to have the VMM console installed to be able to do the authoring of a service template. The other piece that I probably wanted to touch on is VMM 2008 R2, when you set up the VMM self-service portal, even if you could open up the console and see virtual machines there, you'd go to the portal and you wouldn't see virtual machines there. In App Controller, as long as you've got access to those virtual machines, we'll show them to you. So there's nothing special that you need to do to get virtual machines to show up in App Controller. As long as they're in a cloud and as long as you've got permission, whether that's permission because you created it, whether it's permission because someone shared it with you, whether it's permission because you're part of a user role that has the visibility to it, App Controller will just pull all of those virtual machines and services in and give you visibility to those.
So you can use VMM 2012 without introducing clouds, for example, right? So if you upgraded from 2008 R2, you only had a construct of managing hosts within host groups. Now, app controller depends on you having access to clouds. So if you have all your VMs sitting in host groups and you log in, you'll have access. You'll just have access to absolutely nothing, because we anticipate the kind of hierarchy of saying he has access to this cloud, therefore he has access to these objects he's deployed within this cloud. We don't do that exercise on host groups. So VMM obviously recommends that if you're working with VMM 2012 to create clouds over your host groups, or even have one-to-one mapping between clouds and host groups. And if you do that work in VMM, then you'll be able to leverage those clouds inside of App Controller. But we won't work on host groups from VMM 2012. So with that, go ahead and connect to a VMM server, and should be familiar. It's the same clouds view. Go ahead and click Connect to VMM server. Then we have a server set up. Yeah, oh, so some VMM server I'm connecting to, and Richard. .corp.microsoft.com. So type in the FQDN, port 8100 is by default. And what this does here, I want to explain this checkbox here because we'll see it in the library functionality. So it says here, automatically import SSL certificates. What the hell is that doing? So we recommend that when you are connecting to a VMM server, and this is in documentation, this is not just information you'll hear from me today, that when you are making that connection to the VMM server, that you're an admin in the VMM server you're connecting to. In most cases, you will be that admin if you're connecting to a VMM server, but you actually don't have to be an admin in VMM in order to connect to that VMM server. You only need to be an admin in App Controller. The reason we highly recommend, though, that you are an admin in VMM is we actually export those certificates for accessing the library servers that are added to that VMM server, for example, and we use those certificates in App Controller. We import those into the App Controller server so that we can do copying between VMM servers. Now, there is a way that you can, for example, if I uncheck this, then added the server, that I can go back later as a user that is an admin in that VMM server, and there'll be a button which says refresh certificates. And that'll do essentially what this is doing here, not essentially exactly what this is doing here, automatically when the connection is made. So we want to be able to grab those certificates, so when we do copy between VMM library servers, we have access to both ends of the transfer. So highly recommend that you're an admin in both so that you can check this box so you don't have to worry about certificates at all. We do all the magic for you. So click OK, and hopefully that's the right server name. Connect to the VMM server. OK, and you'll see this if you are, this is a complex example, that if you are a member of that VMM server we just added, which I stupidly named it some VMM server, but I'm a member of administrator and self-service users, as Richard has set that up. And so we know what to connect for this session. I'm going to say I want to be an administrator. So we go ahead and add that, and here is a Contoso cloud that is from that some VMM server. We just added it here. And just to show you what that actually did, if I can refresh here. So we log in again. So the same kind of screen here, except across all the different connections that I have in App Controller. So because I'm a part of multiple roles for the Azure subscription here, I'm a part of administrators, part of the development team, and part of the MMS demo role that Richard just selected. I can choose here, basically help App Controller figure out who I want to be, what hat I'm wearing when I log into App Controller for that time. And we do save them as personalization settings. So if I selected CDM Online Management Core Team here, and I came back, refreshed again, or came back tomorrow, that would be the default that came up again. So you don't have to select this every time, but we do show this for you because you may want to pretend to be a different user if you're part of multiple roles. So here I want as much access as I have access to, and I'm going to connect as administrator to all the connections. So that is how easy it is. There was a lot of talking in there, but how easy it is to connect to a VMM server. All you need is to be an admin, or we recommend you to be an admin on the target VMM server, and we need the FQDN of it. But besides that, we do everything else. And with that, we pull in all services that we discover, and since I'm an administrator, we'll see everything that is in that environment. If it refreshes, I believe your server is kind of slow. But, and then also virtual machines from all those servers. And this one's a lot faster. So there's nothing that you need to do extra. And I guess the reason that I'm bringing this up is with VMware, if you wanted to do this in vCloud Director, they actually require this to be greenfield kind of scenario. So you must create the cloud in vCloud Director in order to use all these constructs. And so there's no way that you can kind of inherit VMs that were already deployed and have them show up within like an app controller interface for self-service users. You would have to redeploy those VMs or do a lot of manual legwork to get them to show up. Whereas here, all these deployed assets, I just created clouds around the host groups that they were deployed in, and they showed up here after I granted some RBAC rules to gain access to these clouds. So that's why I kept bringing that up. So back to the PowerPoint deck, and I believe the last thing that we wanted to go through here was the library. Now, Richard talked about what it means to use a library within App Control. And again, you have the VMM part of it, and you have the Azure part of it. So the VMM part, for those of you who've used VMM, you connect to library servers, and you add some shares for those library servers, and then you get to manage your VMM library assets within VMM. Now for Azure, the Azure library here is just blob storage, and you create containers within that blob storage, and you can shove whatever you want into there. And unfortunately, today with Azure, most people are using other programs like Storage Explorer to be able to access their Azure blob storage. Now, we allow you to use both with an extremely simple, basic, similar view across all your VMM library servers you have access to, as well as all the Azure subscriptions and their blob storage that you have access to as well. And the other one that we have, so if you have VMM and Azure, the third one that we give you access to are file shares. So any UNC path that you type into App Control, and I'll show you how that's done, you can copy assets between your file shares to VMM and then between those two into Azure. So again, single pane of glass view into all those three different kinds of places that you can manage library assets. And as part of setup, just behind the covers, just to give you a glimpse of what happens, we set a temporary path that we use because for some of the transfers, they're not point-to-point. So we actually copy them to a temp location and then copy from that temp location to your destination. So by default, we picked some location in C temp or something. But you may want to transfer a VHD that's 500 gigs, and your C drive or whatever doesn't have 500 gigs free. There's a PowerShell commandlet, which is documented, where you can change the default temporary storage that we've chosen in case you need to choose a data disk in your VM that you want to use as your temporary storage location. So using the library demo, wait for this to switch over. So obviously here, we go to the library view. And the first example that I have here is we want to add a share. So I know that there's a share sitting, CMX Store 1 products. I click OK. It's going to go ahead and create a job to add it, and bam, I have access to this share and all the stuff that's inside of it. Now what I can do here is you see I have access to a bunch of Windows Azure subscriptions and also these VMM servers with their own library infrastructure. So I can take, let's look here, products. I could take this README, which I have absolutely no idea what that is, click copy, go to some server here, and just paste it in. This will start a job, and it'll take it from that file share and paste it into this VMM server. And I don't know if we want to wait for that to happen, but just to go on, and we'll come back to that job to see when it's done, we can do the same thing for Windows Azure. So we again select this nebulous README file and select the Windows Azure subscription that I called him Azure again, that Richard just created for us. We'll go into a container he seems to have created, and we can paste it in there. So same exact process, but two totally different storage mechanisms. One I copied from UNC path into VMM, and the other one I copied from UNC path into Windows Azure. But the flow for the user, the exercise that the user participated in, was the exact same. And as you can see here, copied into README, and to check into here, it's still going, it looks like. So the last one that we wanted to talk about, and this is kind of the fancy one if you have multiple VMM servers, is that you have a service template. Let's say I've defined a service template within SCDF VMM01, this VMM server here. And this is what Richard was referring to as the main VMM infrastructure that we use. Oh no, it failed, probably because there's no space free. But SCDF VMM01. we can have a bunch of templates defined here, and we just added Richard's VMM server. Now, I don't want to go ahead and go to that VMM server, then click export, then go through all the VMM UI to export it, then go to the second VMM server, click import, repeat that process. We provide a really easy UI for self-service users to go copy assets between VMM servers. So I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say that I wanted to copy this Windows 2008 R2 service template here. So I click copy from this server. I go over here to the second server that I want to copy it to, go to the templates location, and click paste. Now, what this template is going to do is or what this exercise is going to do is going to look at this template and see what assets are connected to it. In this case, it's an unattended XML file, which is part of the OS configuration of this machine tier, and a VHD for it. Now, if these files existed on the destination machine, I can select them here and map them to an existing resource. Now, if this VHD I copied out of band or it already existed on the server from a previous copy, I don't want to repeat the 250 gig VHD copy all over again, so I'd map it. In this case, it doesn't exist, so I'll say copy to destination. And then again, this unattended Redmond XML file doesn't exist, so I'll copy that to destination. And in that, just those 2 clicks, I managed to select all the dependent assets of this service template with the service template itself. And I'm going to click OK, and it's going to package all those or group them all together and put them on the destination server without having to worry about a manual export and manual import step. We'll automatically figure all that for you so that when this template is done copying over on this destination VMM server, it would be the exact template that was on the source server. So a really neat scenario if you have multiple VMM servers, and we have seen a lot of people that do exercise this a lot. I know we do, for grabbing templates from kind of a source or a main VMM server and sharing them out to multiple VMM servers thereafter. So I don't know if you had anything to add with regards to library stuff.
No, that seems.
OK.
So we're just over an hour in, and we've gone through. We've started from scratch, installed App Controller, added Virtual Machine Manager to import the existing private clouds and services and virtual machines. We added a Windows Azure subscription and saw the services running in Windows Azure. We did a deployment from within App Controller using a service template, and we used the library to manipulate files between Windows Azure and also Virtual Machine Manager servers. So it's actually a lot of stuff that we showed you in the last hour. You can see that it all fits within an hour. Hopefully, what you take away is not, oh my goodness, that was a lot of information, but wow, that was actually pretty easy and quick to get up and running with App Controller so that I've got visibility and control over my services and virtual machines that are running in both public and private clouds. Do people feel like they could go away and install App Controller now, just spin up a VM and get going with it? We've still got 6 minutes before officially the end of the session, but I know it's also the last session of the day, so you're probably pretty keen to go on. More than one connection? To a Virtual Machine Manager server? To Azure. So basically, you have, in our terms, there's a single connection to Windows Azure because that's literally the port for Windows Azure's management piece. What we do is each subscription that you might have access to, we get you to register each subscription. So if you've got 5 Windows Azure subscriptions, because it doesn't actually cost anything to get a Windows Azure subscription. If you've got a Windows Azure subscription and don't deploy anything, don't have anything in storage, you should get a bill for nothing. Where you incur cost is when you actually start deploying and using it. So that the actual cost for subscriptions is pretty low. Now, the result of that is, in a typical example, you might have a subscription for development purposes. You'll then have a subscription for testing an application. You then might have a subscription that's in a staging or a pre-production type environment. And then you might have a subscription for your actual production application. So if you could end up very easily with 4 Windows Azure subscriptions in that instance. We also know, because of the pay-as-you-go and hand over your credit card process and the fact that with MSDN subscriptions, if you take a dev test team of 12 or 13 people that you might have, you've instantly got 12 or 13 Azure subscriptions. And using App Controller, you can actually start to manage those subscriptions a little easier. When we're in the connections view and you saw the virtual machine manager connection and the Azure connection? Is it, I'm obviously missing.
I'm going to bring up the UI here.
Yep.
So there's only one connection to Windows Azure.
Yep.
And then there's connections to VMM servers. And then your connections to Windows Azure are over subscriptions, which you add in this view here. So these are the subscriptions, that he was talking about. Whereas you only have one connection to Windows Azure, and you have properties on that, those proxy settings on a single connection, which Richard was pointing out. This is a connection to Windows Azure's Service Management API. And then we talk subscriptions over that connection.
Sorry, I
one connection.
Totally misunderstood what you were asking. Yeah.
So can users, can they go in and access their VMs and modify properties such as memory, CPU, storage?
So they can go through, they can, do you want to pull up a virtual machine?
Yeah, I want to sign in as not an admin, though. So.
Yeah. So they can go through and modify some of the properties. Now, you specifically mentioned memory, so what if I needed to bump up my memory? Now, with the service templates, you don't have the ability to go through and upsize your memory. Now, what we do internally is we use dynamic memory. So by default, these virtual machines have a minimum of 512 meg of memory, and then we set an upper bound for those machines. And for a lot of our purposes, 2 gig is actually perfectly fine, and the virtual machines can move within that range. Now, in a service template sort of structure, I didn't touch on it, but one of the nice things about service templates is it starts to give you a standardized offering around your virtual machine sizes. And I think of it very similar to back in the days when you would order physical hardware for a project rather than provisioning a virtual machine for a project. If you were ordering computers on a regular basis, you probably found that going to your hardware supplier, you could probably get a better deal if you were buying lots of the same machine rather than lots of custom configured machines. And the management of that then becomes a lot easier as well. A similar process applies with service templates. You can actually start to standardize your offerings around service templates. And I love dynamic memory because you can say, oh, well, yeah, your virtual machine could use 8, 16, 32 gig of memory. But if the virtual machine doesn't really need to use that amount, it can actually stay below that amount of memory.
So if somebody requires their stuff, they say they need 1 CPU, CPU, whatever, and then they access them to, what's the process in which you do that? Does the administrator go in and act the VMA when you that way, or is there self-provisioning that you can do?
Yeah, so the question is, could you do self-provisioning to do so there's 2 ways you could do it. The end result is, as you alluded to, an administrator needs to be in Virtual Machine Manager to make those changes. You could use Service Manager to do a request process and front that. If you had it often enough, you could orchestrate it, but I would sort of suggest that maybe if you find that most customers are saying, oh, I want 1 CPU, and then like, oh, actually, I really need 2 CPUs. Realistically, with the way the hypervisors work, giving someone a 2 CPU machine up front instead of a 1 CPU machine is not the end of the world. If you're talking the difference between 8 and 16, then maybe it makes a difference. But
Is there a roadmap? Last question.
Yeah.
Is there a roadmap for dynamic CPU, dynamic storage, like
yeah, so is there a roadmap around dynamic CPU and disk like there is for dynamic memory? I don't have information on that. That would be coming out of Hyper-V or VMM to support that piece. So that's, yeah.
I think that's, oh, sorry.
Cool. So complete your evals. We're going to be here for a few more questions. I know some of you have probably got dinner plans or want to get to another session. So we're going to be here for a little bit longer. We're also going to be at the Ask the Experts piece. That's the daily end of day one as well. So feel free to come and ask questions individually. Thank you very much for staying through to the end of the day. Enjoy the rest of your week at MMS. It's been a pleasure having you here.